February 3rd, 1949, Budapest. The courtroom was full, but it didn't feel alive. Journalists filled the benches, notebooks ready. Party officials sat in neat rows, faces fixed, rehearsed. Cameras clicked on command. Everything was in place. Everything looked official. And yet, from the first second, something felt wrong. When the guards led the defendant into the room, a quiet ripple moved through the audience. Some reporters leaned forward. Others frowned, confused by what they were seeing. This was supposed to be a powerful man. Just 2 months earlier, he had stood before thousands, preaching with fire, with authority. His voice had filled cathedrals. His presence alone had commanded silence. But the man now shuffling toward the defendant's chair barely resembled that figure. His shoulders sagged. His suit hung loosely on his frame, as if it belonged to someone else. His face was pale, not the color of illness, but of exhaustion pushed far beyond its limits. His eyes moved slowly, unfocused, as if they were struggling to understand where he was. He looked decades older than his age.
As he sat down, the prosecutor stood. His voice was sharp, confident, almost triumphant. You stand accused of treason, espionage, and conspiracy against the People's Republic. How do you plead? There was a pause. Not the kind of pause that comes from hesitation, but the kind that feels mechanical, delayed, unnatural. Then the answer came. Guilty. The word landed flat, hollow. Several journalists exchanged glances. Pencils hovered above paper, unsure whether to write or wait. Something about the moment felt deeply unsettling. This wasn't a man confessing. It sounded more like a line being read by someone who no longer fully understood what the words meant. One reporter later described it as watching a human body speak, without the person inside it. And that was the first crack in the performance. Because what the authorities had prepared as a perfect show trial was already beginning to fail, not legally, but psychologically. They wanted the world to see a broken enemy admitting his crimes. Instead, the world was seeing something far more disturbing. A man who looked like he had been emptied out.
The prosecution pressed on, following the script. Each question was designed to confirm guilt, to present certainty, to close the case neatly in the public eye. But the defendant's responses never quite matched the rhythm. His voice was flat. His expressions lagged behind the conversation. When he spoke, it was as if his mind was always half a step behind his own words. And the journalists noticed. They had covered wars, revolutions, purges. They had seen fear before. This was different. Fear has energy. Fear reacts. This man did not. As the questioning continued, a strange realization began to spread through the room, unspoken, but shared. Whatever had happened to him before this trial, the real battle was already over. And no one in the audience yet understood what that meant. Because while the cameras captured a confession, they could not capture the 39 days that came before it. They could not see the nights without sleep. The endless repetition of questions. The slow erosion of time, memory, and control.
They could not see the moment when a human being stops responding as a person and starts functioning as something else. What they were watching was not the collapse of resistance, it was the aftermath. And somewhere beyond the walls of that courtroom, hidden from every camera and microphone, existed a document that changed the meaning of everything unfolding on that stage. A letter, written months earlier, by a man who already knew this moment would come. A letter that did not declare innocence, but anticipated defeat, and warned the world in advance. If you ever hear me confess, if you ever see me surrender, remember this. It was not the truth speaking. It was what happens when the human mind is pushed past its breaking point. The trial moved forward. The verdict was already decided. But the story the authorities wanted to tell was slipping out of their control. Because for anyone paying close attention, one question now refused to go away. What do you have to do to a man to make him sound like this? And how far can a system go before it destroys the very proof it needs to win?
The Anthony, why there? To understand why this trial matters so much, you have to understand one thing first. This was never about crimes. It was about fear. Not the fear of bombs or armies, but the fear of influence. Because the man sitting in that courtroom was dangerous in a way most people are not. He did not command soldiers. He did not control factories or borders. He had no weapons at all. What he had was something far more difficult to eliminate. He had moral authority. Years before the trial, long before the accusations and the cameras, he had already made himself a problem. Not by plotting in secret, but by speaking in public, loudly, repeatedly, without ambiguity. When others urged caution, compromise, or silence, he chose confrontation. From pulpits across Hungary, his words carried a simple message that the new regime could not tolerate. Loyalty has limits. The state demanded obedience. He insisted on conscience. In a system built on total control, that distinction was intolerable. The communist leadership understood this better than anyone. They had learned from Moscow and from Stalin himself that you do not defeat belief by arguing with it.
You defeat it by destroying its symbols. And he had become one. To ordinary Hungarians, he was not just a church leader. He was proof that someone could say no and survive. Each sermon drew crowds. Each public appearance reinforced the idea that resistance was still possible. That idea was contagious. The regime could arrest priests. They could close monasteries. They could confiscate schools. But as long as this man remained standing, none of it felt final. So the decision was made. He would not be silenced quietly. He would be broken publicly. A show trial was the perfect solution, not because it proved guilt, but because it rewrote reality. A confession, spoken in his own voice, would turn resistance into betrayal, faith into fraud, courage into treason. It would tell the population a simple story. Even your strongest figures eventually collapse. That was the theory. But theory depends on one fragile assumption, that the human being on trial still controls himself. What the planners in Budapest did not fully account for was how far they would have to go to make that assumption come true.
Because this was not a man who expected rescue. When advisors urged him to flee the country, to seek asylum, to save himself while he still could, his answer was not dramatic. It was almost quiet. A shepherd does not abandon his flock. He understood what was coming. He had seen it before, decades earlier, when another communist regime briefly took power and imprisoned him for his beliefs. He recognized the pattern now being repeated across Eastern Europe: arrest, isolation, interrogation, confession, erasure. He did not believe himself immune to that process. In fact, the most unsettling truth is that he never believed he was strong enough to resist it indefinitely. That realization led him to do something extraordinary. Before the knock on the door ever came, before the prison cell, before the interrogations, he sat down alone and prepared for his own failure. Not his martyrdom, his failure. He wrote a document meant for a future moment when his words could no longer be trusted, when his voice might speak, but his will would not. In it, he did not claim heroism. He did not promise resistance. He warned the world instead.
If you ever hear me confess, if you ever read that I have resigned, remember this. It was done under coercion. It was not freely given. It does not represent the truth. By writing those words, he separated his conscience from whatever his body might later be forced to do. It was a quiet act of defiance, and a deeply human one, because it acknowledged something most stories refuse to admit: that there are limits to endurance, and that sometimes the most honest form of resistance is preparing for the moment when resistance fails. When the authorities finally came for him, late at night, with warrants and guns, he did not protest. He did not argue. He did not ask where they were taking him. He simply stood, adjusted his coat, and said he had been expecting them. As the car pulled away into the darkness, leaving the cathedral behind, he could not know exactly what awaited him, but he knew the direction the road was taking, and he knew with unsettling clarity that the real trial would not take place in a courtroom. It would take place in a room with no windows, no clocks, and no witnesses. The room they brought him into was small. Too small to forget. Bright lights burned constantly, erasing the difference between night and day. There were no windows, no clock, no sound except footsteps in the corridor and the door opening when it was time to speak again. At first, the questions were simple. Names, dates, associations. He answered calmly, carefully, the way he always had. But the questions did not stop. They repeated them. Again. And again. And again. Hours passed, then more hours. Sleep never came. Every time his eyes began to close, the door opened. The lights stayed on. The voice returned. The same questions, the same accusations. Confess. At first, he resisted, not with defiance, but with clarity. He corrected false premises. He denied what was untrue. He explained what could be explained. But clarity depends on rest. And rest was denied. After days without sleep, time began to fracture. Minutes stretched unnaturally long, then vanished entirely. He could no longer tell whether something had happened an hour ago or a day ago.
I noticed small things first. The way sentences became harder to finish, the way he had to search for words he had always known. He answered questions and then immediately forgot what he had said. The interrogators noticed too. They adjusted their approach. The questions became more confident, less inquisitive, more declarative. You did this. You met with them. You planned that. When he said no, they repeated the statement, calmly, patiently, until the word no began to feel unfamiliar. Not wrong, just distant. At some point, his own voice started to surprise him. He would hear himself respond before fully understanding the question. The words came out automatically, disconnected from intention. He was no longer deciding what to say. His body was speaking. His mind was trying to keep up. And then came the moments designed not to break him, but to confuse him. They told him his mother was dying, that she wanted to see him one last time, that all he needed to do was cooperate. The problem was not whether the claim was true or false. The problem was that he could no longer tell. Exhaustion stripped away certainty.
Memory blurred. He could not access the part of himself that normally judged, verified, reasoned. He tried to picture her face. The image flickered, incomplete. Was this manipulation? Or was this the last chance to say goodbye? He had no way of knowing, and that uncertainty was the point. Because moral decisions require clarity, they require agency. Here, neither existed. By the third week, his sense of self had begun to loosen. He felt it happening, but could not stop it. Thoughts slipped away before he could hold them. Emotional reactions dulled. Fear faded. Not because it was conquered, but because there was no energy left to sustain it. He did not feel brave. He felt empty. When they finally placed the papers in front of him, he understood dimly what they were asking. Pages of statements, crimes he did not remember committing, conspiracies he could not reconstruct in his mind. His first instinct was refusal, but the instinct did not last. The voice inside him, the one that had guided him his entire life, was still there, faint, distant, struggling to reach the surface. Don't sign. This isn't you.
But another force was stronger now. Fatigue. Confusion. The desperate need for the ordeal to end. His hand moved. Slowly. Heavily. As if it belonged to someone else. The pen scratched across the paper. In that moment, something inside him collapsed, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Later, alone again, a brief moment of clarity cut through the haze. He understood what had happened. He had signed. Not because he believed the words, not because he agreed, but because the part of him capable of refusing had been worn down to silence. The weight of that realization was crushing. He did not fear punishment. He feared meaninglessness. If his own signature could be turned against everything he stood for, then what remained of him? And then, through the despair, another thought surfaced. The letter. The document written months earlier in calm anticipation of this exact moment. Somewhere beyond these walls, his warning existed. They could take his body. They could take his voice. They could even take his name.
but they could not fully take the truth, because he had already separated it from himself. The confession was signed. The machinery moved forward, but the damage was already done, not to him alone, but to the story they were trying to tell. Because when a system must erase a person's mind in order to obtain obedience, it reveals something fatal about its own weakness. The trial would come next, and the world would see the result. Not a criminal exposed, but a human being reduced to the limits of endurance. When the trial resumed, the authorities believed they were finally in control. The confession was signed. The script was complete. The outcome was guaranteed. All that remained was performance. The courtroom filled again with cameras and observers. This time, not only Hungarian officials were watching, but foreign correspondents as well. The regime wanted the world to see order restored, resistance humiliated, authority reaffirmed. They expected outrage to fade. Instead, something else happened. As the defendant was led back into the courtroom, reporters noticed immediately that he had not recovered. If anything, he appeared worse. He moved slowly, as if gravity itself had increased. His eyes struggled to focus.
When he sat, his hands rested motionless on the table, fingers slightly curled, unmoving. The prosecutor began confidently. He referred to the signed documents, the admissions, the crimes. All the pieces were there. But when the defendant spoke, the illusion cracked again. He did not proclaim guilt. He did not defend himself. He did not argue. He simply stated facts in the narrowest possible way. I signed the documents. Not, I committed the crimes. Not, I conspired. Only, I signed. The distinction was subtle, but devastating. The prosecutor pressed harder. You admit your conspiracy against the state? There was a pause, longer this time. For a brief moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Not defiance, not clarity. Recognition. I signed what was put in front of me. That was all. The room shifted. Reporters leaned forward. Pencils moved faster. This was not the confession they had been promised. It was not a declaration of guilt. It was a technical truth. And technical truths are dangerous because they expose what lies beneath the performance.
The defendant did not sound like a man who had chosen betrayal. He sounded like a man describing something that had happened to him. The more the prosecution pushed, the clearer the problem became. They had obtained obedience, but they had destroyed credibility. This was not a man confessing guilt. This was a system revealing its limits. No one watching believed this was a free confession, not because of ideology, not because of sympathy, but because human beings recognize absence. And what was absent here was agency. The foreign journalists did not need evidence of torture. They did not need photographs or testimony. They were looking at it. A confession delivered without conviction. A voice detached from intention. A body present, and a person missing. Then, days into the trial, something happened that the authorities had not anticipated. The letter surfaced, released quietly to the international press by those who had safeguarded it. The document spread rapidly. Its contents were simple, calm, precise. If you ever read that I have confessed, if you ever hear that I have surrendered, know this: it was done under coercion.
It does not represent the truth. The impact was immediate. Suddenly, the trial had a second narrative, one the state could not control. This was no longer a question of guilt or innocence. It was a question of process, of legitimacy,
of what it takes to force a human being to say words he does not own. The verdict, when it came, changed nothing. Life imprisonment, additional years added for emphasis. On paper, the state had won. But outside the courtroom, the damage was irreversible. International condemnation followed. Religious leaders spoke out. Governments protested. Even those unsympathetic to the defendant's beliefs recognized the spectacle for what it was: a confession extracted at the cost of humanity. The regime had demonstrated its power, and in doing so, had revealed its fear. The defendant was taken away again, not to freedom, not to rest, but to years of isolation. Prisons changed, walls changed, guards changed. The silence did not. Years passed. His body weakened, his health deteriorated. Time moved without markers. And then, unexpectedly, the world outside the prison walls began to shift.
In October of 1956, the streets filled with voices: students, workers, ordinary people who had lived too long under enforced obedience. For a brief moment, it seemed as if history might reverse itself. Revolution erupted, prison doors opened, and the man the regime had tried so carefully to erase was suddenly free, not because he had been forgiven, but because the system holding him had cracked. He returned to Budapest to crowds he could barely comprehend. Bells rang, faces blurred together, cameras returned, this time uncontrolled. He spoke again, carefully, briefly. He called for freedom, for conscience, for restraint. And then the tanks arrived. The moment passed. As Soviet forces moved to crush the uprising, a decision was made in haste. He was offered refuge, not in a church, not in his own country, but behind the walls of a foreign embassy. It was meant to be temporary. A few days, a few weeks, it would become something else entirely. Another room, another confinement, another form of silence. The prison without bars, and the longest chapter of his life was about to begin.
There is more temptation, when stories like this end, to search for comfort, to call it a victory, to frame it as inevitable, to pretend the suffering was part of some clean, necessary arc of history. But there was nothing clean about it. What happened to him was not symbolic while it was happening. It was physical. It was slow. It was lonely. History may later place him on the right side of events, but history did not sit with him in those rooms. History did not count the nights. History did not feel the doubt. What endured was not certainty, but choice. The choice to remain when escape was offered. The choice to speak when silence would have been safer. The choice to accept that the body can be forced to betray the mind and still refuse to let that betrayal become the truth. That is why this story does not belong only to the past. Because systems change their language, they change their uniforms, they change their justifications, but the question they ask remains the same. Not whether you will agree, but how much pressure it will take before you comply. He never believed himself invincible. He never claimed immunity from fear.
He only understood something essential about power. That power is never satisfied with silence alone. It wants consent. It wants participation. It wants you to speak the lie in your own voice. And sometimes the only victory available is making sure that voice is not the final word. Empires fall. Records fade. Trials are forgotten. But the line between conscience and coercion
is redrawn in every generation. And every generation is asked the same thing, in its own way. Where does obedience end? And who decides what remains yours to give?